Before tonight's journey begins, let me know where you're listening from. Now, settle in. Let your shoulders soften. Let your breathing slow and allow the day to drift quietly away. Tonight we travel to Whitby in October of 1910, to the harbor wall where the tide retreats over shingle and the smell of salt and coal smoke hangs in the still air. Among them is Thomas Hardwick, a 58-year-old fishmonger, carrying one wicker basket, one oil lantern, and the quiet weight of a widow's grief. He expects only the comfort of a routine that had not failed him in 40 years. But this morning, a stranger waiting at the harbor wall, an old woman with a steady gaze, will alter the course of his day. This is the story of Thomas Hardwick, and of one autumn morning when a man who had long believed that the sea gave only what it took, discovers that the sea gives also what it has kept. So close your eyes, breathe gently, and let your own 2 feet carry you through cobblestones and the breath of the incoming tide. The clock on the mantelpiece struck 4:30. Its chime was thin and brass-toned, a sound that had woken Thomas Hardwick at the same hour for 37 years, and he did not need to open his eyes to count the strokes. He lay still for a moment in the narrow bed, the sheets drawn up to his chin, and listened to the house settling around him. The coal fire in the grate had burned low overnight, and the room held a chill that crept under the covers and touched his ankles. Outside, the street was silent but for the distant grumble of a cart somewhere on Church Street, its iron wheels striking the setts with a rhythm like a slow heartbeat. He swung his legs out of bed and reached for the matches on the washstand. The flare of the lucifer startled a faint orange glow into the room, and he lit the candle beside the looking-glass. The flame steadied, and he saw his own face in the glass, lined, gray-stubbled, the eyes deep-set and the color of wet slate. He did not linger. He pulled on his woolen underdrawers, his flannel shirt, the heavy corduroy trousers that had been patched at both knees, and then the thick blue jersey that Martha had knitted for him 3 winters before she died. The wool smelled of salt and wood smoke, and he fastened the top button with fingers that knew the gesture by heart. The kitchen was cold. He lit the lamp on the table, a brass argand with a glass chimney that had been his father's, and set the kettle on the range. While the water heated, he packed his basket. The wicker was old, the handle bound with tarred twine, and he lined it with a square of clean canvas. He placed his knife, a long, narrow-bladed filleting knife with a handle of blackened horn, into the leather sheath that hung from his belt. Then he took the oil lantern from its hook by the door, checked the wick, and filled the reservoir from the can of paraffin kept on the shelf. The smell of the oil was sharp and clean, and it reminded him of the harbor at low tide, when the mudbanks lay exposed and the air turned thick with brine and tar. He poured the tea, black, no sugar, the leaves dark and bitter, and drank it standing at the window. The glass was filmed with condensation, and he wiped a circle with his sleeve. The street lamps on Flowergate still burned, their gas flames small and yellow against the blue-black of the early sky. No one was about. The town was still sleeping, and he liked that. He liked being the first to move through the silence, the first to set his foot on the cobbles while the night still held its breath. He pulled on his boots, heavy leather, hobnailed, the soles worn smooth at the heel, and laced them with the same careful tension he used to tie a parcel of fish. He shrugged into his coat, a long oilskin that hung to his knees, and he lifted the basket onto his shoulder, the lantern he carried in his left hand, the wire handle cool against his palm. He stepped out into the lane. The door clicked shut behind him, and the key turned in the lock with a soft, final sound. The air was cold and wet, the salt wind coming off the sea in a steady breath that stirred the edge of his coat. Above the rooftops, the sky was beginning to pale, a faint wash of gray in the east, but the stars still held. He could see the plow and Orion and the red glow of Mars low over the abbey ruins. He stood for a moment, letting the cold settle on his cheeks. and then he began to walk. The lane was narrow, the houses leaning in on either side so that the sky was only a ragged strip overhead. His boots rang on the stones, and the sound echoed back from the closed shutters and the darkened windows. He passed the door of the baker's shop, where a faint smell of yeast and warm flour seeped through the cracks, and he passed the iron postbox at the corner, its red paint dim in the lamplight. He turned onto Church Street, and the slope took him downward, toward the harbor and the dark, breathing presence of the sea. A cat slipped out of a doorway and crossed his path, a thin tabby with a torn ear, and it paused to look at him before vanishing into the shadows of a yard. He smiled, a brief, private thing, and continued on. The lantern swung at his side, casting a pool of yellow light that moved ahead of him, illuminating the wet stones, the overflowing gutter, the occasional white pebble caught in a crack. He could hear the tide now, a soft, endless shushing, like a woman drawing a long breath. The smell of salt grew stronger, and with it came the smell of wet rope and tar, of fish and cold iron, the harbor smell that had been in his blood since he was a boy. He reached the bottom of the street, where the road opened onto the quayside. The harbor lay before him, a dark sheet of water that shimmered with the reflected lights of the town. The fishing boats were moored in a row, their masts black against the sky, and the rigging sang a faint, thin note in the wind. The tide was nearly out, and the stone steps that led down to the water were slick with weed and slime. He stopped at the edge of the quay, set down his basket, and listened. It was the moment he waited for each morning, the moment when the world seemed to pause, when the sea and the sky and the town held their breath together, and he was alone in the middle of it, a small, quiet figure in the great dark. He did not know, then, that this morning would be different. He did not know that the rhythm he had followed for 40 years was about to be broken by a single, unexpected presence. He only knew that the air was cold, that the lantern was warm in his hand, and that the fish would be waiting at the market shed. He picked up his basket and walked on, toward the harbor wall, and the first gray light of dawn began to thread its way through the clouds. The market shed stood at the far end of the quay, a long, low building of red brick and corrugated iron, with a roof that sagged in the middle like the back of an old horse. The doors were open and a warm yellow light spilled out onto the wet cobbles, mingling with the gray of the morning. Thomas could hear voices, low, rumbling, punctuated by the occasional sharp laugh and the slap of wet fish on wooden tables. He quickened his step, the lantern swinging, and he ducked inside. The air was thick with the smell of fish and ice and salt, and beneath it, the sour tang of old blood and the clean, metallic scent of the sea. The building was lit by a row of gas lamps that hissed and flickered, casting long shadows across the floor. The auction was already beginning. The buyers stood in a loose circle around the long tables, their hands in their pockets, their eyes moving over the piles of fish that gleamed under the light. The auctioneer, a man named Arthur Dunning, stood at the head of the table, his voice a rapid sing-song chant that rose and fell like the tide. Thomas took his place at the edge of the crowd, his basket at his feet, and he listened. He knew the auctioneer's rhythms. He knew that the price of cod would be high this morning because the catch had been light, and that the herring would be cheap because the night boats had come in with their nets full. He watched the fish as they were lifted and turned, the silver flanks of the mackerel, the mottled backs of the plaice, the dark, sleek bodies of the conger eels that coiled in baskets. He bought what he needed, a box of herring, a dozen cod, a handful of haddock, and a single halibut, huge and flat, that Arthur Dunning held up with both hands and called out as a beauty, a proper beauty, straight from the Dogger Bank. Thomas paid in coin, the silver and copper worn smooth from years of use, and he packed the fish into his basket with the care of a man who knew that a bruised fillet was a lost sale. The work was familiar, and it kept his hands busy, but his mind drifted. It drifted to the kitchen at home, where the kettle still sat on the range, and to the empty chair at the table, the one that faced the window. Martha had always sat there, her back to the stove, so that she could watch the street. She had liked to see the first light touch the rooftops, and she had always said that the morning was the best part of the day, because it was still full of possibility. He had not believed her then. He had been too tired, too focused on the day's work, to see the possibility in the gray light. But now, in the year since she had gone, he had come to understand what she meant. The morning was the only time he felt something like hope, a quiet, fragile thing, like the flame of a candle in a draught. He left the market shed as the auction was winding down, the buyers dispersing to their carts and shops. The sky had lightened to a pale, pearly gray, and the clouds were tinged with pink along the eastern horizon. The tide was turning, and the water in the harbor began to stir, lapping against the stone walls with a soft, rhythmic sound. He walked along the quay, past the nets that were spread on the cobbles to dry, past the stacks of lobster pots, past the old man who sat on a bench outside the lifeboat station, smoking a pipe and staring at the sea. The man raised his hand in a silent greeting, and Thomas nodded. He was nearly at the harbor wall when he saw her. She was standing at the very end, where the stone arm curved out into the water, just beyond the line of moored boats. She was wearing a long, dark coat and a gray shawl, and she was looking out at the sea, her hands resting on the iron railing that ran along the edge. She was old, older than him perhaps, with white hair that escaped from under her bonnet, and a face that was lined and weathered like the rocks on the headland. She did not turn when he approached, but she must have heard his footsteps, because she spoke without looking at him. "You're early," she said. Her voice was low and rough, like gravel rolling in a wave. He stopped a few feet from her, setting down his basket. "I'm always early," he said. "It's my trade." "I know," she said. "I've seen you." She turned her head, and her eyes met his. They were pale blue, the color of winter sky, and they held a steady, searching gaze that made him feel as though she could see through the lines of his face and the salt crusted on his boots. "I've been waiting for you," she said. He did not know what to say. He had never seen her before, and yet she spoke as though they had known each other for years. He looked at the harbor, at the water that was beginning to catch the light, and he felt a strange, quiet unease, like the first tremor of a boat against its mooring. "You've been waiting?" he said. "Every morning," she said, "for a week. I watched you come down from Church Street, and I watched you buy your fish, and I watched you walk back with your basket full. I knew you would stop here eventually. Why?" She looked back at the sea. "Because I have something for you," she said. "Something that belongs to you." She reached into the pocket of her coat and drew out a small object. It was a shell, a cowrie, pale and smooth, with a dark opening along its length. She held it out to him, and he took it, his fingers brushing against hers. The shell was warm from her pocket, and it felt light and fragile in his palm. "I don't understand," he said. "You will," she said. "Now, go on with your round. The fish will wait, but the morning won't." She turned and walked away, her footsteps soft on the stone, and she disappeared into the gray light, heading toward the steps that led up to the churchyard. He stood there, holding the shell, and he watched her go. The wind tugged at his coat, and the lantern flame flickered, and he felt the weight of the basket on his shoulder, and the weight of the shell in his hand, and the weight of the grief that he had carried for a year, and he did not know what to do with any of it. He tucked the shell into the pocket of his coat, next to his pipe, and he picked up his basket. The round was waiting. The round was not a simple thing. It was a geometry of streets and doorways, of back steps and kitchen windows, of brass knockers and iron gates. and Thomas knew each point of it with the same unconscious precision with which he knew the grain of a fillet of cod. He had been walking the same route for 23 years, ever since he had taken over the business from his father, and he had learned the habits of every housewife, every cook, every scullery maid who answered the door. He knew that Mrs. Appleton on Bagdale always took 2 haddock on a Tuesday, that the hotel on the West Cliff ordered a stone of herring every Friday, and that the old miser who lived in the cottage on the end of the pier never bought anything but smoked mackerel, and only then if he could haggle the price down by a halfpenny. He left the harbor and climbed the slope toward the town, his boots finding the worn stones with a familiarity that was almost instinct. The streets were waking now. The first shopkeepers were opening their shutters, and the smell of fresh bread drifted from the bakery on the corner. A milk cart rattled past, the horses' hooves striking sparks from the cobbles, and the milkman called out a greeting. Thomas nodded, but he did not stop. The basket was heavy on his shoulder, and the fish were still cold, and he wanted to deliver them before the day grew warm and the ice began to melt. His first stop was the house of a widow named Mrs. Thornley, a small, neat woman who lived in a cottage on the far side of the market square. She took a single cod every week, and she always paid in the same way, a shilling and a halfpenny, wrapped in a scrap of paper, handed over with a smile that was both grateful and sad. Thomas knocked on the door, and she opened it, her hair already pinned up and her apron clean. She took the fish, wrapped in a piece of brown paper, and she pressed the coins into his hand. He thanked her, and he moved on. The next stop was the hotel, a grand whitewashed building that overlooked the sea, with a wide veranda and a flag flying from the roof. The cook was a man named Mr. Patterson, a portly, red-faced fellow who had a voice like a foghorn and an opinion on everything. Thomas found him in the kitchen, standing over a pot of stock, his sleeves rolled up and his face glistening with steam. He took the herring without a word, examined them with a critical eye, and then nodded. "Not bad," he said. "Not bad at all. The catch was good last night, then?" "Aye," said Thomas. "Good enough." "Good enough for me," said the cook, and he counted out the coins and dropped them into Thomas's palm. The morning settled into its rhythm. He walked from street to street, from door to door, and the basket grew lighter as the hours passed. The sun rose above the rooftops, burning off the mist, and the air grew warm and still. The gulls wheeled overhead, their cries sharp and hungry, and the sound of the sea grew fainter as he moved inland. He passed the fish market again, but it was empty now. The tables washed down and the doors closed. He passed the old man on the bench, who was still smoking his pipe, and he passed the church, where the clock struck 9. He had delivered all but the halibut. That was for the last stop, the house at the end of the pier, the cottage of the old miser who never bought anything but smoked mackerel. But Thomas had not bought smoked mackerel that morning, and he did not know what he would do with the halibut. He had bought it on impulse, because Arthur Dunning had called it a beauty, and because he had not been able to bear the thought of it going to the hotel kitchen, where it would be cut into steaks and served with butter sauce, and no one would remember it by the time the plates were cleared. He reached the end of the pier, and he stopped. The cottage was small, built of stone, with a slate roof and a single chimney that gave off a thin curl of smoke. The door was closed, and the windows were dark. He hesitated. He did not know why he had come here. The old miser would not want halibut. He would want his smoked mackerel, and he would be angry if he did not get it. He knocked. There was no answer. He knocked again, and after a long moment, the door creaked open. The old man stood in the doorway, his face crumpled like a piece of paper, his eyes watery and red. And he was wearing a shirt that had once been white, and his trousers were held up by a piece of string. He looked at Thomas, and then at the basket, and he said, "You're late." "I know," said Thomas. "I'm sorry. I have something different today." The old man peered at the basket, What is it? Halibut. The old man stared at him. Halibut? He said. I don't eat halibut. I eat smoked mackerel. I've always eaten smoked mackerel. What do you think I am, a gentleman? No, said Thomas. I just thought, I don't know. I thought you might like a change. The old man looked at him for a long time, his eyes narrowing. Then he reached out and took the halibut, wrapping it in his own hands. He held it up, feeling its weight, and he sniffed it. It's fresh, he said. It is, said Thomas. The old man grunted. He turned and went back into the cottage, and he returned a moment later with a handful of coins. He pressed them into Thomas's hand, and then he closed the door. Thomas stood there, holding the coins, and he felt a strange, quiet satisfaction. He had sold the halibut. He had sold it to a man who had never bought anything but smoked mackerel, and he had sold it for a fair price. He did not know why it mattered, but it did. He turned and walked back along the pier, the empty basket swinging at his side. The sun was high now, the sea a deep, glittering blue, and the gulls were silent. He reached the harbor wall, and he stopped. The old woman was not there. The shell was still in his pocket, and he touched it, running his thumb over its smooth surface. He did not know what it meant. He did not know why she had given it to him, but he knew that he would keep it, and that he would think about her, and that he would come back to the harbor wall tomorrow, and the day after, until he understood. The afternoon passed in a slow, familiar haze. Thomas returned to his shop, a narrow room on the ground floor of his house, with a counter of worn oak and a slab of marble that had been his father's and his grandfather's before him. He cleaned the fish he had not sold, gutting them with quick, precise strokes of his knife, and he laid them on a bed of crushed ice that he had brought up from the cellar. The shop was cool and dark, and the smell of fish and salt and ice was so deep in the walls that he could not imagine it ever leaving. He did not have many customers in the afternoon. The morning trade was the main trade, but a few women came in, their baskets over their arms, and they bought what they needed. He spoke to them politely, his voice low and even, and he wrapped their purchases in brown paper and tied them with string. But his mind was not on the shop. It was on the shell, and on the old woman, and on the strange, hollow feeling that had settled in his chest. He had put the shell on the windowsill above the sink, where it caught the light, and he had looked at it a dozen times during the afternoon. It was a cowrie, smooth and pale, with a dark opening that seemed to lead into a deeper darkness. He had never seen a shell like it on the Whitby beaches. The cowries he knew were small and brown, the kind that children collected in buckets. This one was larger, and its surface was almost translucent, like the bone of a seabird. He closed the shop at 5 o'clock, as he always did, and he went upstairs to the kitchen. He lit the fire, put the kettle on, and sat down at the table. The chair across from him was empty, and he looked at it for a long time, as he did every evening. He had not moved Martha's things. Her sewing basket was still on the sideboard, her book of poetry was still on the shelf, and her shawl was still hanging on the hook behind the door. He had not been able to let them go. He had not been able to let go of anything. He ate his supper, a piece of cold fish, a slice of bread, a cup of tea, and he washed the dishes by hand, drying them with a cloth and putting them away in the cupboard. The routine was soothing, and it kept him from thinking. But when he was finished, when the kitchen was clean and the fire was burning low, he sat down again, and he took the shell from his pocket. He held it in his palm, and he turned it over, and he wondered. He had not told anyone about the old woman. He had not told the baker, or the milkman, or Mrs. Thornley. He had not told anyone because he did not know what to say. He had met a stranger on the harbor wall, and she had given him a shell, and she had said it belonged to him. It was a small thing, a trivial thing, and yet it had lodged in his mind like a splinter, and he could not pull it out. He went to bed early, as he always did, but he did not sleep well. He lay awake, listening to the wind in the chimney, and the creak of the house, and the distant sound of the sea. He thought about Martha, and about the mornings they had spent together, and about the way she had laughed when he had told her about the old miser who would only eat smoked mackerel. He had not laughed in a long time. He had not felt like laughing. He must have fallen asleep at some point, because the clock woke him at 4:30, and he rose, and he dressed, and he packed his basket, and he lit his lantern, and he walked down to the harbor. The morning was the same as it had been the day before, cold, dark, the tide low, the stars bright. He reached the market shed, and he bought his fish, and he did not see the old woman. He did not see her the next day, or the day after that, but he looked for her every morning. He looked for her at the harbor wall, and on the steps, and among the nets, and he did not find her. He began to wonder if he had imagined her. He began to wonder if the shell was a trick of the light, a piece of beach glass that had caught his eye, a fragment of a dream. But he kept the shell in his pocket, and he touched it when he felt the weight of the grief, and he did not know why, but it helped. It helped him to think of the old woman, with her steady gaze and her rough voice, and to think of the possibility that she had something to give him that he did not yet understand. On the fourth morning, after the old woman had given him the shell, Thomas woke with a strange restlessness. He had slept badly again, his dreams filled with the sound of the sea and the image of a pale, empty horizon. And when he opened his eyes, the familiar rhythm of the day felt stifling, like a collar that was too tight. He did not want to go to the market. He did not want to walk his round. He did not want to stand in the shop and wrap fish in brown paper and listen to the same voices, the same stories, the same questions about the weather and the price of cod. He dressed slowly, his movements heavier than usual, and he carried his basket to the door. But when he stepped out into the lane, he did not turn right, toward the harbor. He turned left, toward the cliff path that led up to the abbey. The path was steep and narrow, cut into the side of the headland, and it was slick with dew. The grass was wet, and the stones were loose, and he had to watch his footing. He had not walked this way in years, not since he was a boy, when he and his friends had climbed the cliffs to look for gulls' nests. The path wound upward, and the town fell away behind him, the rooftops growing smaller, and the harbor shrinking to a silver crescent. The wind was stronger here, and it whipped his coat around his legs and tugged at his hat. He could hear the sea, a deep, constant roar, and he could see the waves breaking against the rocks far below, sending up plumes of white spray. He climbed until he reached the top, where the ground leveled out and the ruins of the abbey stood against the sky. The stones were dark and weathered, splashed with lichen and moss, and the empty windows looked out over the sea like blind eyes. He stood among them, catching his breath, and he looked at the water. It was gray and restless, stretching to the horizon, and the clouds were low and heavy, pressing down on the surface like a lid. The wind was cold, and it carried the smell of salt and wet stone, and he felt a strange, quiet peace. He had not come here for a reason. He had come because he could not bear to go to the market, and because the path had been there, and because he had needed to move. He sat down on a fallen stone, the basket beside him, and he took the shell out of his pocket. He held it up to the light, and he saw the faint, milky translucence of its surface, the way the light seemed to gather in the dark opening. He had never seen a shell like it. He had never seen a shell that seemed to hold the light inside itself. He thought about the old woman. He thought about the way she had stood at the harbor wall, her hands on the railing, her eyes fixed on the sea. He thought about the way she had spoken, her voice low and rough, as though she had been carrying a secret for years and had finally decided to let it out. He thought about the way she had said, "I have something for you," and he wondered what it was, really, that she had given him. A shell, a piece of the sea, a thing that belonged to him, she had said, but he did not know how. He sat there for a long time, the wind around him, the sea below him, the sky above him, and he did not think about the shop, or the round, or the fish, or the grief. He thought about nothing, and he felt the wind on his face, and he breathed the salt air, and he let the silence settle around him. When he finally stood up, his legs were stiff, and his hands were cold, and the sun had moved higher in the sky. He walked back down the cliff path, his steps slow and careful, and he returned to the town. The market was closed, and the morning was over, and he had missed his round. He had never missed his round before. He had never missed a single delivery in 23 years. He went home, and he put the kettle on, and he sat at the table. He looked at the empty chair, and he thought about Martha, and he thought about the old woman, and he thought about the shell. He did not know what it meant, but he knew that something had changed. He did not know how, but he knew that the morning would never quite be the same. The next morning, Thomas returned to the harbor. He did not know why, but he felt that he had to go back. He had to see if the old woman was there, or if she had left something behind, or if he had simply imagined the whole thing. He walked down the same streets, past the same doors, through the same gray light, and he reached the market shed. He bought his fish, but he did not linger. He walked to the end of the harbor wall, where he had first seen her, and he stood there, looking out at the sea. She was not there. The wall was empty, the iron railing cold and wet, the water dark and still. He waited. He watched the gulls, and the boats, and the slow, steady movement of the tide. He waited for a long time, and then he turned to go. But as he turned, he saw something on the stone at his feet. It was a small piece of paper, folded into a square, and it was held down by a pebble. He bent down, and he picked it up, and he unfolded it. The paper was damp, and the ink was smudged, but he could read the words. "Come to the Abbey at sunset. I will be there." He did not know who had written it. He did not know if it was from the old woman, or from someone else, or if it was a trick, but he folded the paper carefully, and he put it in his pocket, next to the shell. He finished his round, and he worked through the day, and he did not tell anyone about the note. As the afternoon wore on, he began to feel a quiet, nervous anticipation. He had not been to the Abbey since the day he had walked the cliff path, and he had not been to the ruins at sunset in many years. He remembered the way the light fell on the stones, the way the shadows stretched like fingers across the grass, the way the sea turned to gold and then to gray. He remembered the feeling of standing among the ruins, of being small and alone and yet not lonely, of being part of something larger. He closed the shop at 5 o'clock, as always, and he ate his supper, and he washed the dishes, and he put on his coat. He walked up the hill, past the church, past the houses, and he climbed the steps that led to the Abbey. The sun was low, a red ball sinking into the clouds, and the sky was streaked with orange and pink and purple. The wind had died, and the air was still, and the only sound was the distant cry of a gull. The Abbey was empty. The ruins stood in the golden light, their shadows long and dark, and the grass was wet with the evening dew. He walked through the gateway, and he waited. He did not know where to stand, or how long to wait, but he waited. After a few minutes, he heard footsteps. He turned, and he saw the old woman. She was walking toward him, her dark coat and gray shawl the same as before, her white hair loose around her face. She looked tired, but her eyes were steady, and she smiled when she saw him. "You came," she said. "I came," he said. "I found your note." She nodded. She walked past him, into the ruins, and she stopped at the edge of what had once been the nave. The sun was behind her, and her shadow stretched across the grass. She looked at the sea, and she said, "I have been waiting for you for a long time." "I don't understand," he said. "Who are you?" She turned to face him. "My name is Margaret," she said. "I was your wife's sister." The words hit him like a wave. He stepped back, his breath catching in his throat. He had not known that Martha had a sister. She had never spoken of one. He had never met her. He had never even heard her name. "I know," she said, as if she could read his thoughts. "She never spoke of me. We had a quarrel many years ago, and she cut me out of her life. I moved away to the south, and I did not come back until after she had died. I did not know she had died until it was too late." She paused, and she looked down at the ground. "I came back to Whitby to find you," she said. "I wanted to give you something that belonged to her, something that she had given me before the quarrel." She reached into her pocket, and she pulled out a small, leather-bound book. It was worn, the cover faded, the pages yellowed. She held it out to him, and he took it. "It's her diary," she said. "She wrote in it every day, for years. She gave it to me when we were young, and I kept it. I thought you should have it." He opened the book. The first page was dated 1882, and it was written in Martha's handwriting, the letters small and neat, the ink fading to brown. He saw the words. "Today I walked to the harbor and saw the boats. The sea was calm, and I felt happy." He closed the book, and he held it against his chest, and he felt the tears come. He did not speak. He could not speak. He stood there, in the ruins, in the sunset, and he held the book, and he wept. The sun had set, and the sky was turning to ash, and the wind had risen again, cold and sharp. Thomas stood with the diary in his hands, the leather warm against his palms, and he did not know what to say. Margaret stood beside him, her hands folded in front of her, her gaze fixed on the darkening sea. "I'm sorry," he said at last. "I did not know. She never told me." "She had her reasons," Margaret said. "I was not a good sister. I was jealous of her, and I said things that I should not have said. She was right to cut me out, but I have spent the years since regretting it, and I wanted to make amends, even if it was too late." She turned to him. "I have been watching you, Thomas. I have seen how you carry your grief, how you hold it inside you, how you do not let it go. I wanted to give you something that might help you to let it out." He looked at the diary. "You have given me everything," he said. "I did not know that she had written. I did not know that she had kept a diary. I did not know so many things." "She was a private woman," Margaret said. "She loved you, but she kept her own world. This is her world, Thomas. Read it. Let her speak to you." She reached out and touched his arm, a brief, light touch. "I will not stay," she said. "I have no place here, but I will leave you with this, and I will hope that it brings you peace." She turned and walked away, her footsteps soft on the grass, and she disappeared into the shadows of the ruins. Thomas stood alone, the diary in his hands, and he listened to the wind and the sea and the silence of the stones. He walked home slowly through the dark streets, the lantern casting a small, yellow light before him. He did not look at the diary until he was sitting at the kitchen table, the fire burning low, the kettle on the range. He opened it, and he read. He read about Martha's childhood, her love of the sea, her fear of the dark. He read about the day she had met him, the first time he had come to the shop, and how she had thought he was too serious, too quiet, too old for her. He read about the day they had been married, and the day they had moved into the house on Flowergate, and the day she had learned that she could not have children. He read about the quarrel with her sister, and the years of silence, and the regret that she had carried like a stone. He read until the fire burned low, and the candle guttered, and the clock struck midnight. He read until his eyes were dry, and his throat was tight, and then he closed the book, and he sat in the dark. He understood, now, why the old woman had given him the shell. It was not a message from the sea. It was a message from Martha. It was a a small, fragile thing, that she had been there, that she had loved him, that she had left something behind. He put the diary on the shelf, next to the shell, and he went to bed. He slept, for the first time in a year, without dreaming of the sea. Thomas sat at the kitchen table long after the fire had crumbled to ash. The diary lay open before him, its pages catching the last of the candlelight, and he traced his finger along the lines of Martha's handwriting, feeling the faint indentation of the nib against the paper. He had read the entries from the early years of their marriage, the years of quiet happiness, the years when the world had seemed full of promise. But there were later entries too, entries that he had not yet read, and he knew that they would be harder to bear. He turned the page, and he saw a date that he recognized, the 14th of March, 1898. It was the day she had told him that she was ill. He remembered the way she had sat in the very chair where he now sat, her hands folded in her lap, her voice steady and calm. He remembered the way the light had fallen on her face, the way she had smiled, the way she had said, "I have something to tell you, and it is not easy." The entry was short. "I told him today. He did not cry. He held my hand, and he said that we would face it together. I love him more than I can say. I am afraid, but I am not alone." He closed the book. He could not read any more that night. He stood up, and he walked to the window, and he looked out at the street. The lamps were lit, their yellow light pooling on the wet cobblestones, and the houses were dark and silent. He thought of Martha, of her voice, of her hands, of the way she had looked at him on that day. He thought of the years that had passed, and the years that he had spent alone, and he felt the weight of his grief settle over him like a shawl. He went to bed, but he did not sleep. He lay in the dark, listening to the clock, counting the hours until dawn. He thought about Margaret, about the diary, about the shell. He thought about the old woman, and the note, and the abbey. He thought about the way the sea had looked that morning, gray and still, and the way the gulls had cried, and the way the light had fallen on the stones. When the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, he rose, he dressed, and he made his tea, and he ate his bread. He did not look at the diary. He put it in his pocket, next to the shell, and he set out for the harbor. The streets were empty, the air cold and damp. The fog had returned, thin and gray, and it muffled the sounds of the town. He walked quickly, his footsteps echoing on the pavement, and he reached the harbor just as the first boats were putting out to sea. He bought his fish, as he always did, and he spoke to the fishermen, and he carried the baskets back to the shop. But his mind was not on the fish. It was on the diary, on the words that he had not read, on the story that he had not yet finished. He worked through the morning, and he worked through the afternoon, and he did not open the book until the shop was closed and the streets were quiet. He sat at the kitchen table, the diary before him, and he read. He read about the months of illness, the visits to the doctor, the treatments that did not work. He read about the pain, the fear, the hope that flickered and died. He read about the last days, the last hours, the last words that she had written. "I am tired. I am so tired, but I am not afraid. He is here. He is always here." He closed the book, and he held it to his chest, and he wept. He wept for Martha, and he wept for himself, and he wept for the years that had passed, and the years that would never come. He wept until his tears were spent, and then he sat in the silence, and he listened to the ticking of the clock. He thought about the shell. He took it from his pocket, and he held it in his palm, and he looked at the lines and the grooves and the faint, pearlescent sheen. He thought about the sea, about the depths, about the creatures that lived in the dark. He thought about the old woman, and the note, and the abbey. He thought about Margaret, and the diary, and the gift that she had given him. He did not know what to do with the shell. He did not know if it was a sign, or a message, or simply a thing that the sea had cast up. But he knew that it was important. He knew that it was connected to Martha, and to the diary, and to the story that he was beginning to understand. He put the shell back in his pocket, next to the diary, and he went to bed. He slept, but he dreamed of the sea. He dreamed of the waves, and the tide, and the sand, and the shells. He dreamed of Martha, standing on the shore, her hand raised in greeting. He dreamed of the old woman, and the abbey, and the light that fell on the stones. When he woke, the dream was still with him, like a faint, distant echo. He lay in the dark, and he listened to the wind, and he thought about the day ahead. He thought about the fish, and the shop, and the routine that had become his life. But he thought, too, about the diary, and the shell, and the old woman, and the story that was not yet finished. He rose, and he dressed, and he made his tea. He put the diary in his pocket, and the shell in his pocket, and he set out for the harbor. The fog was thinner, and the sky was pale, and the air was cold. He walked through the streets, past the houses, past the shops, past the church, and he reached the harbor. He bought his fish, and he spoke to the fishermen, and he carried the baskets back to the shop. But he did not open the shop. He put the baskets on the counter, and he locked the door, and he hung the sign that said, "Closed." He walked to the end of the harbor wall, and he stood there, looking out at the sea. The water was gray, the waves were small, and the gulls were circling. He took the diary from his pocket, and he opened it, and he read. He read the last entry, the one that she had written on the day before she died. "I am writing this in the morning, before the light comes. The pain is bad, but I am not afraid. I know that he will be with me until the end. I know that he will remember me. I know that he will carry me with him, in his heart, always." He closed the book, and he held it in his hands, and he looked at the sea. The tide was coming in, and the waves were rising, and the water was dark and cold. He thought about Martha, and about the years that they had shared, and about the years that he had spent alone. He thought about the shell, and the diary, and the old woman, and the gift that she had given him. He did not know what to do. He did not know how to let go. He did not know how to move forward. But he knew that he could not stay where he was. He knew that he had to find a way to carry the grief, and the love, and the memory, and to keep walking. He put the diary back in his pocket, and he turned, and he walked back to the shop. He opened the door, and he took the baskets, and he began to prepare the fish for the day. He worked slowly, carefully, his hands moving with the same precision that they had always had. He worked until the morning was gone, and the afternoon came, and the light began to fade. He closed the shop, and he walked home, and he sat at the kitchen table. He opened the diary, and he read the first entry again. "Today I walked to the harbor and saw the boats. The sea was calm, and I felt happy." He smiled. He closed the book, and he put it on the shelf, next to the shell. He sat in the silence, and he listened to the wind, and he thought about the morning. He thought about the fish, and the harbor, and the sea. He thought about Martha, and the diary, and the shell. He thought about the old woman, and the abbey, and the light that had fallen on the stones. He did not know what the future held. He did not know if he would ever find peace, but he knew that he had taken a step. He knew that he had opened the door and let the light in. He knew that he had begun to let go. The next morning, Thomas woke to a different light. The fog had lifted, and the sky was clear, and the sun was rising over the sea, pale and gold. He lay in bed for a moment, listening to the sound of the gulls, and he felt a quiet calm settle over him. He did not know why, but he knew that something had changed. He rose, and he dressed, and he made his tea. He did not look at the diary. He did not touch the shell. He put on his coat, and he walked to the harbor, and he bought his fish. He spoke to the fishermen, and he carried the baskets back to the shop, and he opened the doors. The morning passed in its usual rhythm. the customers coming and going, the scales glistening, the knives sharp and steady. But at midday he closed the shop. He hung the sign, and he walked up the hill, past the church, past the houses, and he climbed the steps that led to the abbey. The ruins stood in the bright light, their stones warm and dry, and the grass was green and soft. He walked through the gateway, and he stood at the edge of the nave, and he looked out at the sea. The water was blue, and the waves were small, and the gulls were circling. He could see the boats, and the harbor, and the houses that clung to the cliffs. He could see the path that led along the coast, winding through the grass, and he thought about the day that he had walked it. He thought about the shell, and the note, and the old woman. He thought about Margaret, and the diary, and the gift that she had given him. He did not know why he had come. He did not know what he was looking for, but he knew that he had to be there, in the ruins, in the light, with the sea before him. He took the diary from his pocket, and he opened it, and he read a passage at random. The cliffs are so high, and the sea is so deep. I feel small when I stand here, but I do not feel afraid. I feel part of something larger. He closed the book, and he smiled. He thought about Martha and the way she had loved the sea. He thought about the way she had talked about the cliffs, and the waves, and the wind. He thought about the way she had looked at the world, with wonder and with calm. He walked to the edge of the ruins, and he looked down at the path that led to the beach. He could see the steps, carved into the stone, winding down the cliff. He had not taken that path in years. He had not walked on the beach since Martha had died. He had avoided it because it was too painful, too full of memory. But today, he felt the pull. He felt the need to go down, to stand on the sand, to feel the water at his feet. He took a breath, and he began to descend. The steps were steep, worn by the years, and he had to move carefully. He held the rail, and he watched his feet, and he listened to the sound of the waves, growing louder as he descended. The air changed, becoming cooler and damper, and he could smell the salt and the seaweed. He reached the bottom, and he stepped onto the sand. The beach was empty. The tide was out, and the sand was damp and dark, and the water was far away. He stood there, looking at the expanse of sand, the rocks, the pools of water that reflected the sky. He felt the wind on his face, and he heard the cry of the gulls, and he felt a strange, quiet joy. He walked to the water's edge, and he stood there, looking out at the sea. The waves were small, and they lapped at the sand, and the water was clear and cold. He took off his shoes, and he rolled up his trousers, and he stepped into the water. The cold was sharp, but it did not hurt. It was a clean, honest cold, and it woke him, and it made him feel alive. He stood there, in the water, and he thought about Martha. He thought about the day that they had come to this beach, the first time that he had met her. She had been walking along the shore, collecting shells, and she had looked up and smiled. He had not known, then, that she would become his wife. He had not known that she would become his whole world. He closed his eyes, and he let the water wash over his feet. He felt the sand shift beneath him, and he heard the waves, and he felt the wind. He thought about the shell that he had found, and the diary that he had read, and the old woman who had given him the gift. He thought about Margaret, and the abbey, and the light that had fallen on the stones. He opened his eyes, and he looked at the sea. The water was gray, and the sky was pale, and the world was quiet. He stood there, in the water, and he did not feel sad. He did not feel lost. He felt, for the first time in a year, that he was where he was meant to be. He stayed there for a long time. He walked along the beach, and he looked at the rocks, and he watched the waves. He found a small, smooth stone, gray and round, and he put it in his pocket. He did not know why, but he knew that it was important. He knew that it was a sign, a small, quiet thing, that the world was still turning and that he was still part of it. When the sun began to sink, he walked back to the steps and he climbed the cliff. He reached the top and he looked back at the sea. The water was gold and the sky was orange and the world was beautiful. He thought about Martha and he thought about the shell and he thought about the diary. He thought about the old woman and the abbey and the light that had fallen on the stones. He walked home through the darkening streets and he felt a quiet peace. He did not know what the future held. He did not know if he would ever find his way, but he knew that he had taken a step. He knew that he had opened the door and let the light in. 3 days passed. Thomas read the diary from cover to cover, and he began to read it again, more slowly this time. He learned things about Martha that he had never known. He learned about her childhood, her fears, her dreams. He learned about the quarrel with her sister, the words that had been said, the silence that had followed. He learned about the regret that she had carried, and the hope that she had never quite let go. He wanted to speak to Margaret again. He wanted to thank her, and to ask her more questions, and to understand the story that was still unfinished. He did not know where she lived, or how to find her, but he knew that she had come to the abbey, and he knew that she might come again. He walked to the abbey every evening, at sunset, and he waited. He stood in the ruins, and he looked out at the sea, and he listened to the wind. He waited for 3 days, and on the 3rd day she came. She walked through the gateway, her dark coat and gray shawl, the same as before, her white hair loose around her face. She looked tired, but she smiled when she saw him. "You are still here," she said. "I am still here," he said. "I wanted to thank you." She nodded. She walked to the edge of the nave, and she looked at the sea. "I have been thinking about you," she said. "I have been thinking about Martha. I have been thinking about the things that I should have said, and the things that I should have done." She paused, and she looked at him. "I was jealous of her," she said. "She was younger, and she was prettier, and she was loved. I was not. I was awkward, and plain, and full of anger. I did not know how to be happy for her. I did not know how to be a sister." She looked down at the ground. "The quarrel was about a man," she said. "A man that I loved, and who loved her. It was not her fault. She did not know. But I blamed her, and I said terrible things, and I walked away. I did not write to her, and I did not come back, and I did not know that she had died until it was too late." She reached into her pocket and she pulled out a small, worn photograph. It was yellowed and faded, and it showed 2 young women standing on a beach, their arms around each other. "This was taken in 1880, she said. "We were happy then. We were sisters." She held the photograph out to him, and he took it. He looked at the faces, and he saw Martha, young and smiling, her hair loose, her eyes bright. He saw Margaret, standing beside her, her face turned to the camera, her smile small and shy. He saw the love that had been there, and the loss that had followed. "I have carried this photograph for 20 years, she said. "I have carried it, and I have looked at it, and I have wished that I could go back. I have wished that I could take back the words, and the silence, and the years. But I cannot. I can only give you the diary, and the photograph, and the hope that you will find peace." He looked at the photograph, and he felt the tears come. He did not try to hold them back. He let them fall, and he let them wash away the grief that he had carried for so long. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you for giving me this. Thank you for telling me." She nodded. She reached out, and she touched his arm, a brief, light touch. "I will not stay," she said. "I have a train to catch. I am going back to the south, to my home. But I will write to you, if you will let me. I would like to know you. I would like to be part of your life." He looked at her, and he saw the same eyes that he had seen in Martha's face. He saw the same kindness, the same sadness, the same hope. "I would like that," he said. "I would like that very much." She smiled, and she turned, and she walked away. He watched her go, her figure growing smaller in the twilight, until she disappeared into the shadows of the ruins. He stood alone, the photograph in his hands, and he listened to the wind and the sea and the silence of the stones. He walked home slowly, through the dark streets, the lantern casting a small, yellow light before him. He did not look at the photograph until he was sitting at the kitchen table, the fire burning low, the kettle on the range. He held it in his hands, and he looked at the faces, and he felt the love that had been there, and the loss that had followed. He put the photograph on the shelf, next to the diary and the shell. He sat in the silence, and he listened to the clock, and he thought about the morning. He thought about the fish, and the harbor, and the sea. He thought about Martha, and Margaret, and the story that was still unfolding. He did not know what the future held. He did not know if he would ever find peace, but he knew that he had taken a step. He knew that he had opened the door and let the light in. He knew that he had begun to let go. The days that followed were quiet. Thomas returned to his routine, the early mornings at the harbor, the long hours in the shop, the preparation of the fish, the careful weighing and wrapping. But something had shifted. The routine was no longer a cage. It was a rhythm, a steady, comforting pulse that carried him through the hours. He still carried the diary and the shell in his pocket, but he did not read the diary as often. He did not need to. The words had become part of him, woven into his thoughts, his memories, his dreams. He knew that Martha was not gone. She was with him, in the way that the sea was with him, in the way that the wind was with him, in the way that the light was with him. One evening, as the sun was setting, he walked to the harbor. He did not have a purpose. He simply wanted to be there, to watch the water, to feel the air. He stood at the end of the harbor wall, looking out at the sea, and he felt a quiet, deep calm. He took the shell from his pocket, and he held it in his palm. He looked at the curves, the ridges, the faint, pearlescent sheen. He thought about the creature that had lived inside it, the tiny, fragile being that had built this perfect, delicate house. He thought about the sea and the sand and the currents that had carried the shell to the shore. He thought about the old woman and the note and the abbey. He thought about Margaret and the diary and the photograph. He lifted the shell to his ear and he listened. He heard the faint, distant roar of the sea, the sound that people always spoke of, the sound that was said to be the echo of the ocean. But he heard something else, too. He heard a quiet, steady rhythm, like a heartbeat. He heard the pulse of the world, the slow, constant turning of the earth. He closed his eyes, and he let the sound wash over him. He felt the wind on his face, and he felt the sun on his skin, and he felt the weight of the years lift from his shoulders. He did not know how long he stood there, but he knew that something had changed. He knew that he had let go. He opened his eyes, and he looked at the shell. It was still the same, small and fragile, a thing of the sea, but it was no longer a symbol of his grief. It was a symbol of his love. It was a reminder that Martha had been there, that she had loved him, that she had left something behind. He put the shell back in his pocket, and he turned, and he walked home. The streets were quiet, the lamps were lit, and the sky was dark. He walked slowly, his footsteps steady, his breath calm. He reached the house on Flowergate, and he opened the door, and he stepped inside. He did not light the lamp. He sat in the dark, and he listened to the silence. He thought about Martha, and he thought about the years that they had shared. He thought about the grief and the loss and the slow, steady healing. He thought about the future and the unknown and the quiet hope that had begun to grow. He went to bed, and he lay in the dark, and he listened to the clock. He did not count the hours. He did not wait for the dawn. He simply lay there, and he breathed, and he let the night wrap around him. And then, without warning, without effort, he felt the first wave of sleep begin to rise. It was not a sudden collapse, but a slow, gentle surrender. He felt his limbs grow heavy, and his thoughts grow soft, and his breath grow deep. He felt the world begin to fade, the sounds of the street, the ticking of the clock, the beating of his own heart. He did not fight it. He did not hold on. He let it come, and he let it take him, and he felt the peace that he had been seeking for so long. Sleep came. It did not ask permission. It did not announce itself. It simply arrived, like the tide, like the slow, steady pulse of the sea. And Thomas, the fishmonger of Whitby, the man who had carried his grief like a stone, the man who had not slept in a year, finally let go. Sleep came. It did not ask permission, and it did not announce itself. It arrived as the tide arrives, as the night arrives, as the silence arrives. It rose from the depths of his body, from the places that he had kept locked and guarded, and it spread through him like a warm, slow current. He felt it first in his feet. The ache that he had carried for so long, the ache of the early mornings, the cold cobblestones, the long hours of standing, began to dissolve. The tension in his calves, the tightness in his knees, the weary weight of his bones, all of it began to soften, to loosen, to sink into the mattress. He felt it in his hands, the hands that had held the knife, that had scaled the fish, that had wrapped the parcels, that had carried the baskets, the hands that had held the shell, and the diary, and the photograph, the hands that had held Martha's in the last days, in the last hours. They relaxed, their fingers uncurling, their palms opening, and they rested at his sides. He felt it in his chest, the tightness that had been there since the day that Martha had died, the knot of grief that he had carried like a second heart, began to loosen. He felt the breath move deeper, slower, easier. He felt the walls of his chest expand, and the air fill the spaces that had been empty for so long. He felt it in his throat, the lump that had been there, the word that he had not spoken, the cry that he had not released, began to dissolve. He swallowed, and he felt the constriction ease, and he felt the silence grow deeper. He felt it in his eyes. The lids grew heavy, the lashes fluttered, and the images of the day began to blur. The harbor, the fish, the shop, the customers, the abbey, the sea, all of it began to fade, to recede, to become soft and distant. He felt it in his mind. The thoughts that had been running, circling, repeating, began to slow. The worry, the regret, the memory, the hope, all of it began to settle, like sediment in a still pool. The surface grew calm, and the water grew clear, and the thoughts became quiet. He did not dream, not yet. He simply sank, deeper and deeper, into the dark, warm water of sleep. He felt the weight of the years lift from his shoulders, and he felt the lightness of a body that had finally let go. He thought of Martha. He saw her face, not as it had been in the last days, pale and tired, but as it had been in the early years, bright and full of life. He saw her smile, and he heard her laugh, and he felt the warmth of her hand in his. He thought of the sea. He saw the waves, the gray and green and blue, the endless, rolling water. He saw the shells, the sand, the rocks, the light that fell on the surface. He felt the cold and the salt and the wind. He thought of the diary. He saw the words, the small, neat handwriting, the stories that she had told. He saw the pages, yellowed and worn, and he felt the love that she had written into them. He thought of the shell. He saw it in his hand, small and fragile, a thing of the sea. He heard the sound of the ocean, the faint, distant roar, the steady, rhythmic pulse. And then the thoughts began to fade. The images grew soft, the sounds grew distant, and the world became a blur of light and shadow. He felt the bed beneath him, the pillow against his cheek, the weight of the blankets. He felt the warmth of his own body, the slow, steady beat of his heart. He sank deeper. The water grew darker, warmer, stiller. He felt the boundaries of his body dissolve, and he felt himself become part of the darkness, part of the silence, part of the night. He slept. He slept without dreaming, without moving, without knowing. He slept as the hours passed, as the clock ticked, as the wind blew. He slept as the moon crossed the sky, and the stars wheeled, and the earth turned. He slept, and the grief that he had carried for so long began to heal. He slept, and the love that he had held for so long began to grow. He slept, and the peace that he had sought for so long began to settle. He slept. The hours passed without measure. The clock ticked, and the wind blew, and the night deepened. Thomas lay in the dark, his body still, his breath slow, his mind quiet. He had entered a place that he had not visited in a year, a place of deep, dreamless sleep, where time had no meaning, and where the world did not exist. The room was dark, the curtains were drawn, and the street lamps cast a faint, yellow glow through the cracks. The air was still, and the temperature was cool, and the bed was warm. The sheets were soft, and the pillow was firm, and the blankets were heavy. He lay on his back, his arms at his sides, his legs straight, his face turned slightly to the side. His breathing was slow and even. The rise and fall of his chest, the gentle movement of his ribs, the faint, steady rhythm of his heart. The air entered his lungs, and it left them, and it entered again, a cycle that continued without thought, without effort, without end. His muscles were loose. The tension that had been there, the tightness that had been his constant companion, had dissolved. His jaw was slack, his brow was smooth, his hands were open. He was no longer holding anything. He was no longer carrying anything. He was simply lying there, in the dark, in the silence, in the peace. The silence was not absolute. There were sounds, but they were soft and distant, and they did not disturb him. The ticking of the clock, the creak of the house, the rustle of the wind, the faint, far-off cry of a gull, the murmur of the sea, the whisper of the leaves. They were the sounds of the night, the sounds of the world, the sounds that had always been there, and they wrapped around him like a blanket. He did not dream. He did not move. He did not think. He was simply present, in the dark, in the quiet, in the deep, still place of sleep. The hours passed. The moon crossed the sky, and the stars wheeled, and the earth turned. The night grew deeper, and the darkness grew thicker, and the silence grew softer. Thomas lay in the bed, and he slept, and he healed. He did not know how long he slept. He did not know when the dream began, but at some point, in the deep, still hours of the night, a dream came to him. He was walking along the beach. The sand was damp and dark, and the water was far away, and the sky was gray. He was alone, but he did not feel lonely. He walked, and he walked, and he walked, and he did not know where he was going. He saw a figure in the distance, a woman, standing at the water's edge. She was wearing a white dress, and her hair was loose, and she was looking out at the sea. He walked toward her, and as he drew closer, he saw that it was Martha. She turned, and she smiled. She looked at him, and she said, "I have been waiting for you." He stopped, and he looked at her. She was young, and she was beautiful, and she was alive. He wanted to reach out, to touch her, to hold her, but he could not move. "It is time to let go," she said. It is time to let me go. You have carried me for long enough. You have carried the grief and the love and the memory, but it is time to let it all go. He felt the tears come, but he did not try to stop them. I do not know how, he said. Yes, you do, she said. You have already begun. You have opened the diary. You have held the shell. You have walked the beach. You have let the sea wash over you. You have already begun to let go. She reached out, and she touched his face. Her hand was warm, and it was soft, and it was real. I love you, she said. I have always loved you, and I will always love you. But you must let me go. You must live your life. You must find your peace. He closed his eyes, and he felt the warmth of her hand. He felt the love, and the loss, and the letting go. He felt the grief dissolve, and the peace settle, and the night wrap around him. When he opened his eyes, she was gone. The beach was empty, and the sea was still, and the sky was gray. But he did not feel sad. He felt a quiet, deep calm. He felt the peace that he had been seeking for so long. He woke. The room was dark, and the clock was ticking, and the wind was blowing. He lay in the bed, and he breathed, and he felt the tears on his cheeks. He did not wipe them away. He let them fall, and he let them dry, and he let them become part of the night. He turned onto his side, and he closed his eyes, and he slept again. This time, the sleep was deeper, and it was still, and it was without dreams. He slept, and he healed, and he let go. The first light of dawn crept through the curtains, pale and gray, and it touched the walls of the room. Thomas opened his eyes, and he lay still, and he listened to the silence. The clock had stopped. He did not know when, he did not know why, but he did not mind. He rose, and he dressed, and he made his tea. He walked to the window, and he looked out at the street. The lamps were still lit, and the cobblestones were wet, and the sky was pale and clear. The world was quiet, and it was still, and it was beautiful. He put on his coat, and he walked to the harbor. The streets were empty, and the air was cold, and the fog had lifted. He reached the harbor, and he stood at the end of the wall, and he looked out at the sea. The water was gray, and the waves were small, and the gulls were circling. The boats were putting out, their sails catching the wind, and the fishermen were calling to each other. The world was waking, and it was turning, and it was carrying on. He took the shell from his pocket, and he held it in his palm. He looked at the curves, the ridges, the faint, pearlescent sheen. He thought about the sea, and the sand, and the currents that had carried the shell to the shore. He thought about the old woman, and the note, and the abbey. He thought about Margaret, and the diary, and the photograph. He thought about Martha, and the dream, and the peace that had come. He lifted the shell to his ear, and he listened. He heard the faint, distant roar of the sea, the sound that people always spoke of. But he heard something else, too. He heard a quiet, steady rhythm, like a heartbeat. He heard the pulse of the world, the slow, constant turning of the earth. He put the shell back in his pocket, and he turned, and he walked to the fish market. He bought his fish, and he spoke to the fishermen, and he carried the baskets back to the shop. He opened the doors, and he began to prepare the fish for the day. The day passed in its usual rhythm. The customers came and went. The scales glistened. The knives moved. He worked with the same precision, the same care, the same steady hands. But he worked with a new lightness, a new ease, a new peace. When the sun set, he closed the shop. He walked home, and he ate his supper, and he washed the dishes. He sat at the kitchen table, and he looked at the shelf. The diary was there, and the photograph was there, and the shell was there. They were no longer symbols of his grief. They were reminders of his love. He took the shell, and he held it in his hand. He looked at it, and he thought about the sea. He thought about the tides and the currents, and the vast, deep, endless water. He thought about the creatures that lived in the dark, the shells that lay on the sand, the light that fell on the surface. He put the shell to his ear, and he listened. He heard the sound of the sea, the faint, distant roar. He heard the sound of the night, the quiet, steady pulse. He heard the sound of his own breath, slow and calm. He heard the sound of peace. He put the shell down, and he went to bed. He lay in the dark, and he listened to the silence. He thought about Martha, and he thought about the morning. He thought about the fish, and the harbor, and the sea. He closed his eyes, and he breathed, and he let the night wrap around him. He felt the sleep begin to rise, slow and gentle, like the tide. He did not fight it, he did not hold on. He let it come, and he let it take him, and he felt the peace that he had finally found. The sea was different, the grief was gone, the love remained, and Thomas slept,